The emergency room doors burst open at 2:47 in the morning, and Emily Carter was still holding a bloody compress against a stranger's arm when the helicopter hit the landing pad hard enough to rattle the windows. She looked up. Through the rain-streaked glass, she counted 8 soldiers, full tactical gear, moving fast. Her stomach dropped before her brain caught up. You! Administrator Richard Vance stepped into her path, blocking her view. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he'd already decided. You don't belong in that trauma room. You never did. Emily said nothing. What Vance didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man bleeding out on that gurney was carrying a medical code she'd memorized 6 years ago in a classified briefing room that didn't officially exist. And she was the only person in this hospital who could read it. What city are you watching this story from? Leave a comment below. I want to know how far my story has traveled. Don't forget to follow the channel and hit the like button so you never miss what comes next. The town of Ralston, Montana had exactly one hospital, one diner that closed at 8, and a population that mostly agreed on everything, including the fact that outsiders took longer to fit in than they ever admitted. Emily Carter had been here 14 months. She still felt like an outsider. It wasn't dramatic, the way people made her feel small. Nobody at Kessler Valley Medical Center screamed at her in the hallways or wrote her name on bathroom walls. It was quieter than that. It was the charge nurse, Donna Pruitt, who stopped mid-sentence whenever Emily entered the break room, as if the conversation were something Emily hadn't earned the right to hear. It was Doctor. Marcus Holt signed through his nose before he answered her questions, that particular exhale that meant, I'm going to explain this slowly, even when Emily had already looked up the answer and was only confirming it. It was the way Administrator Richard Vance looked through her, rather than at her when he walked the floor, as if her presence were a minor clerical error that hadn't been corrected yet. She told herself it didn't bother her. She was better at telling herself things than most people. Emily was 29, 5'4", with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to fix, and a habit of rolling her left shoulder when she was thinking through a problem. An old injury that had healed wrong and reminded her of itself in the cold. She had a face that people called young and meant as an insult, and she wore her dark hair pulled back so tight it gave her headaches by the end of a shift. She didn't bring homemade food to the potlucks. She didn't join the fantasy football bracket. She answered questions with the minimum number of words required, and then went back to work, which some people read as arrogance, and others read as something they couldn't name but didn't like. She had her reasons for being here. She didn't share them. What she was, professionally speaking, was excellent. She knew that the same way she knew her own blood type, not from pride, but from fact. She could read a trauma patient in 30 seconds. She anticipated complications before the attending noticed the warning signs. Her medication calculations were precise in a way that had nothing to do with double-checking and everything to do with the kind of drilling that got into your bones. Dr. Holt had quietly corrected a dosage error she'd flagged 2 months ago without acknowledging she'd caught it first, and she'd let it go because the patient was the point, not the credit. The night of October 14th started the same as most nights. She came in at 11, changed into scrubs, clocked in. The ER was mid-level busy. A fractured wrist from a bad ladder situation, a toddler with a fever that had scared the parents more than the numbers warranted, an elderly man with chest pressure who turned out to be having a panic attack and needed someone to sit with him more than he needed medication. Emily did all of this. She also covered for a tech named Paolo who'd gone home sick, restocked 2 crash carts, and drank bad coffee from a machine that had been broken for 6 weeks and nobody had fixed. Donna Pruitt found something to criticize in everything she did. The documentation wasn't formatted correctly. The IV line wasn't taped the way Donna preferred. Emily had apparently said something to a patient in room 4 that Donna had decided was outside scope. Though when pressed, Donna couldn't articulate what specifically had crossed the line. Emily didn't argue. She corrected the documentation. She retaped the IV. She moved on. At 2:11 a.m., a man was brought in by ambulance with lacerations across his torso and upper thighs consistent with a fall onto industrial debris. Or so the paramedic said. Emily was the first nurse to receive him, and she noticed 3 things immediately. The lacerations were too clean-edged for a fall, the bruising pattern around his rib cage was bilateral and precise, in a way that suggested impact from a controlled force rather than a tumble, and the man himself was in a controlled unconscious state, Not the loose, responsive unconsciousness of someone who'd hit their head, but the flat, contained kind that she associated with people who had been trained not to make noise when they were in pain. The paramedics had listed him as John Doe. No ID, no personal effects, no phone. She was beginning her assessment when Richard Vance appeared at the trauma room entrance. Vance was 53, with the kind of silver hair that looked expensive and the kind of posture that came from decades of being the tallest person in every room he'd chosen to enter. He had been administrator at Kessler Valley for 11 years. He had a habit of appearing in the ER during unusual situations that Emily had initially read as genuine engagement and had since revised to something more like territorial surveillance. Nurse Carter. He said her name the way people said a word they'd already decided was spelled wrong. What are we looking at? Unidentified male, approximately mid-30s. Lacerations don't match the reported mechanism. He's unconscious, but the presentation is atypical. I'd like to do a full secondary survey before we... Dr. Holt is on his way down. I know. I'd like to start the survey now. There's a notation on his... She stopped herself. There was a code on the patient's left inner wrist. A small, precise tattoo that looked to most people like a serial number or a personal symbol. To Emily, it was something else. There's a notation I need to look at more carefully before we proceed. Vance glanced at the tattoo. That's a personal tattoo, Nurse Carter, not a medical notation. I understand why it looks that way. I'm glad you understand something. He turned toward the door. Dr. Holt will lead this. You'll assist as directed. She wanted to say 6 different things. She said none of them. Holt arrived 8 minutes later, still pulling on his white coat, and did the assessment the way he always did. Methodically, unhurried, with the confidence of someone who had been right enough times that he'd stopped accounting for the times he hadn't been. He ordered imaging and a standard trauma panel. He didn't ask Emily for her observations. She offered them anyway, keeping her voice neutral, presenting the facts about the lacerations and the bilateral bruising as calmly as she could. Holt listened the way he usually listened to her, with his chin tilted up slightly, which meant he was already preparing his response before she finished speaking. The bruising pattern could be from the fall. Industrial sites have irregular surfaces. The depth-to-width ratio on these cuts is more consistent with a sharp implement than jagged debris. Emily. He used her first name when he wanted to signal that the conversation was over. I appreciate your thoroughness. Let's wait for imaging. She stepped back. She documented her observations in the chart, every single one of them, with timestamps, because if she was wrong, she wanted it on record. And if she was right, she needed it on record even more. The imaging came back at 2:44 a.m. There were fragments, 3 of them, small and embedded at depths that didn't come from falling onto debris. They came from something that had been moving fast in the opposite direction. She was reading the scan when Vance reappeared. Nurse Carter. His voice had shifted slightly, tighter, with something underneath it. I need you to step out. Dr. Holt should see these results immediately. The fragments are, I said step out. Mr. Vance, this patient has shrapnel. Security. He said it without raising his voice. He didn't need to. 2 security guards materialized from the hallway. Not hospital security in the usual sense, but the after-hours contract staff who were large and professionally uninterested in context. Escort Nurse Carter to the break room. She's off this case. You can't... She stopped herself. She looked at the security guards. She looked at Vance. She looked at the patient on the table. Document this, she said to anyone who would listen. Document that I'm being removed while imaging shows metallic fragments in an unidentified patient. Nobody wrote anything down. They walked her to the break room. One of them stood outside the door. She sat down. She stared at her hands. She breathed. The thing about Emily Carter was that she didn't panic. It wasn't that she was unnaturally calm. Her hands were trembling slightly right now, and there was a hot, terrible anger sitting in her chest that she wasn't sure what to do with. But panic required a belief that things were beyond management, and Emily had been in situations that were considerably beyond this one, and she had managed them. She had learned to think inside bad situations rather than around them. She thought about the code on the man's wrist. There were 18 alphanumeric characters in that tattoo. She'd only seen 3 characters before the security guards moved her back, but 3 was enough. The prefix was one she'd been briefed on during a 40-minute session in a building in Virginia that had no public address. She'd been 23 years old, 6 weeks into her assignment to a unit whose name didn't appear in any official military documentation. The patient on that table was not a civilian accident victim. She needed to be back in that room. She was still working through her options when the windows rattled. It was a low, heavy vibration, the kind that came from a helicopter, but not a med-flight helicopter. Not the weight and rhythm of those. This was something heavier. Multiple rotors. She'd only heard that sound a handful of times in her life, and every one of those times had been somewhere that people with regular lives didn't go. She stood up. The security guard outside the break room door turned his head. Through the small window in the door, she watched him look down the hallway toward the ER entrance. She watched his posture change, the slight backward step, the unconscious shift of weight that people made when they encountered something that didn't fit the category they'd prepared for. Emily put her hand on the door. The guard didn't stop her. He was too busy staring at whatever was coming down the hallway. She opened the door and stepped out. The ER looked different than it had 6 minutes ago. The overhead lights felt more exposed somehow. Several nurses and techs had clustered near the nursing station with the specific stillness of people who'd decided that not moving was the safest approach to a situation they didn't understand. Doctor. Holt was standing in the middle of the floor with his tablet hanging loosely from one hand, and the expression on his face was the one she'd never seen there before. Not confidence, not mild condescension, but something closer to confusion. 4 men in tactical gear came through the ER doors first. They didn't run. That was the thing about people trained the way these men were trained. They moved with the particular efficiency of those who'd learned that speed and movement were different things, and that purposeful was faster than fast. They swept the room in seconds, positioning at the corners, hands not on weapons, but near them. Then 2 more came through, and between them was a man in combat utilities without insignia, and behind him was a woman Emily didn't recognize. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, in civilian clothes that had the specific quality of being more expensive than they looked. The man in utilities looked around the room and said, in a voice that carried without being loud, "Who is in charge here?" Vance stepped forward. Emily watched him do it, the instinctive executive move, positioning himself at the center of the situation, collecting it under his authority before anyone else could. "I'm Richard Vance, Chief Administrator. I need to know, we have an individual in this facility who requires immediate assessment by a medic with a specific clearance." The man wasn't looking at Vance. He was looking around the room. "I'm going to need to know who has been treating him." "That patient is under Dr. Holt's care." "What's his current status?" Holt said, "Stable. We're managing the imaging findings and—" "The imaging findings." The man in utilities stopped moving. "What did imaging show?" There was a beat of silence in which Emily watched Holt understand, from the question alone, that he had missed something significant. "Metallic fragments," Holt said carefully. 3 detected so far, embedded in— Where's the nurse who flagged that? The woman in civilian clothes spoke for the first time. Her voice was controlled in the way that meant she'd trained for controlled. "The first responder who noted the wound inconsistency." "Where are they?" Vance said. "There was a staff issue that needed to be addressed. The situation is under control." "What staff issue?" The security guard who had stood outside the break room door was still in the hallway. He looked at Emily. The woman in civilian clothes followed his gaze. Emily was standing at the edge of the corridor, still in her scrubs, her ID badge turned sideways against her chest, the way it always went when she moved fast. She met the woman's eyes. The woman said, "Name." "Emily Carter, charge nurse, ER rotation." "You flagged the wound inconsistency? And the imaging, and the wrist notation." She kept her voice even. "I was removed from the case before I could complete my assessment." The man in utilities turned slowly to look at Richard Vance. Vance said, with the confidence of someone who had been the highest-ranking person in every difficult conversation he'd ever had, "The nurse was interfering with the clinical process. I made an administrative decision. You removed the one person in this building who could identify this patient's medical protocol," the woman said. Her voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had flattened out completely, become factual in a way that was worse than anger. "You removed her. and then you put an untrained team on a patient with active fragment wounds and a level 7 medical notation. Vance blinked. A level 7? Do you know what that means? He didn't answer. Emily did. She kept the knowledge behind her teeth because this wasn't the moment, but she knew exactly what it meant. It meant the man on that table had a specific systemic risk factor that standard trauma protocols would not account for, and if the wrong compound hit his bloodstream in the wrong sequence, something that any routine intervention might trigger without knowing, the consequences would not be limited to the patient. Nurse Carter. The man in utilities was looking at her now with an expression she recognized from a different context entirely. Not the workplace deference of a hospital hierarchy, but the specific attentiveness of people who were used to assessing capability quickly and didn't have time to be wrong. When did you last complete a Protocol 7 intervention? She thought about how to answer that in a room full of people who had no clearance for the real answer. 6 years ago, she said. But the procedure doesn't change. He nodded once. Can you do it now? She looked past him toward the trauma room. She thought about the fragments. She thought about the timing. She thought about the cold, mechanical anger she'd been carrying around in her chest for 14 months of being looked through and talked over and walked past and dismissed, and how none of that mattered right now because a man was bleeding out 30 feet away and she was the only person here who knew what to do about it. Yes, she said, but I need the room cleared of non-essential personnel, and I need someone to tell me what he was carrying. The woman in civilian clothes reached into her jacket and produced a folded document. She handed it to Emily without ceremony. Emily unfolded it, read it, refolded it, handed it back. Richard Vance said, "Now wait a moment." The man in utilities said, "Step back." He said it the same way he said everything else, without volume, without performance. And Richard Vance, who had been stepping forward in rooms for 30 years and having people move out of his way, stepped back. Emily walked to the trauma room. She pushed through the door and looked at the man on the table. Under the harsh fluorescent light, she could see things Holt hadn't cataloged. The specific color at the edges of the largest laceration, the shallow irregularity in the breathing that wasn't distress but was a precursor to it. The way his fingers were curled with the particular tension of someone whose nervous system was beginning a process that would become a crisis in somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes. She had 20 minutes then, maybe 30 if she was precise. She wasn't sure she was going to be. She pulled on gloves. She looked up at the monitor. She took one breath, just one, the way she'd been taught, the specific discipline of not taking two, and she reached for the tray. "Someone get me a 12 gauge, she said to the tech who'd remained in the room. "And find me whatever you have on him that came in with the ambulance, every single thing." The tech moved. Emily moved. The monitors kept beeping. Somewhere behind her, through the closed door, she could hear Richard Vance's voice, higher now than it had been, with a quality in it she hadn't heard from him before. She didn't listen to what he was saying. She had stopped listening to Richard Vance. She was already working. The silence stretched long enough that one of the federal agents glanced over at them. Mercer broke it first, but not the way she'd expected. He didn't deny it. He didn't deflect. He turned to face the corridor wall and put one hand flat against it, like he needed something solid, and said, "I've been running this operation for 11 months. 5 people on my team knew his location at any given time. I've had the same 4 of them since the beginning. And the 5th? Rotated in 6 weeks ago. Analyst. Young, credentialed, came through standard vetting." He exhaled. "I liked him." Past tense. "Yeah." He turned back around. Past tense. Emily said nothing. This was the part of the work she remembered from before. The specific exhaustion of realizing the breach was close, not distant, that the person who gave you up was someone whose coffee order you knew. "You need to pull him before your team debriefs," she said. "If he knows the operation collapsed tonight, he'll sanitize whatever he has access to." "I know." "Do you have someone who can do that quietly?" "I have someone." He was already reaching for his phone. "Give me 2 minutes." She gave him the 2 minutes and spent them watching the federal agents process the corridor. They were efficient. Not fast exactly, but thorough, the particular rhythm of people who had done this enough times to stop wasting motion. One of them was photographing the door of the small OR room. Another was with Gerald, getting his statement. The man Emily had taken down in the dark, the most capable of the 4, the one who'd come the closest to making it a real problem, was now in federal custody in the stairwell, hands cuffed behind him, not talking. She looked at her forearm. The swelling was worse than she'd thought. She'd need ice, and she needed to mention it to someone with medical authority before she forgot about it entirely, which she was aware she might otherwise do. Mercer came back. "It's handled." "Good." "The analyst is being picked up as we speak. His apartment's being secured." He paused. "He's 26 years old." Emily didn't offer a response to that because there wasn't one that helped. Young people made choices for money or ideology or fear, and the rest of it was consequences. She'd seen it before. The lead agent, the one who'd almost smiled, came toward them with a tablet and a recording device. "Ms. Brooks, we're ready for your statement when you are." "She's ready now," Emily said, because referring to herself in the third person had always struck her as unnecessary. The statement took 40 minutes. She gave it seated in the family consultation room where she'd first talked to Mercer, which felt like a small irony. The agent, her name was Vasquez, she said at the start, without specifying title or division, asked the questions in the methodical sequence of someone building a timeline, and Emily answered them in order, without editorializing. What she saw, what she did, why she made each decision. She was specific about the reasoning, why the signal jammer told her about the operational plan, why the photograph mattered, why she'd prioritized the service corridor over the main stairwells. At some point, Vasquez stopped asking about the events and started asking about Emily's background, and Emily gave her the same thing she gave everyone: the nursing license, the hospital employment history, the years of clinical experience. Vasquez wrote it down. Then she looked up, and before nursing, military service. Branch? Army. Specialty? Combat medic. Vasquez wrote that down too slowly, in the way of someone who is writing down the thing they're being told and thinking about the thing they're not being told. She didn't push further, partly, Emily thought, because Vasquez was experienced enough to recognize a door that wasn't going to open, and partly because none of it changed the events of the previous 2 hours, which were what she actually needed for her file. "One more question," Vasquez said. "When you entered the dark OR room and engaged the fourth subject, you had no weapon at that point?" "No." "And you were aware he was armed?" "Yes." "Why did you go in?" Emily considered the question, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give the right one. "Because there was nobody else between him and the patient," she said, "and the patient couldn't wait for someone else to be available." Vasquez looked at her for a moment. Then she closed the tablet cover and said, "Thank you, Ms. Brooks." Emily went to find ice for her arm. Well, the ER at 3:15 a.m. was quieter than it had been at midnight, the way hospital ERs move in cycles, the surge of late-night arrivals subsiding into the slower traffic of very early morning, the hours that belong to people who've been holding out hope that whatever's wrong would get better on its own. Dara was still at the station. One of the overnight residents was writing notes at a workstation in the corner. Everything hummed with its ordinary frequency. Dara looked at Emily when she came back to the floor, looked at the ice pack on her arm, looked at her face. "Do I want to know?" Dara said. "Probably not tonight." "Are you okay?" "Nothing serious." Dara nodded slowly, with the particular acceptance of someone who has worked enough night shifts to understand that sometimes things happen in a hospital that don't make sense until later, and you just have to trust the people you've been working alongside. She handed Emily a fresh set of chart updates without being asked, and Emily sat down and started working through them, because her shift was still her shift. She'd been at it for about 15 minutes when Cross came back down. She saw him before he saw her. He came through the stairwell door instead of the elevator, which she noted as unusual, and he stood at the edge of the corridor for a moment as if he was orienting himself to the ordinary noise of the floor after whatever the third floor had been. Then he walked toward the nurse's station and stopped a few feet from where she was sitting. She kept her eyes on the chart. "Surgery's done," he said. "How'd it go?" "He's in recovery. Blood pressure's holding." He was quiet for a second. "It was a close case. If the pneumothorax had gone unaddressed for another 3 or 4 minutes." He stopped. "But it didn't," she said. "No." He stood there, She could feel him constructing something, assembling words in the way people do when they need to say a thing they don't usually say and can't quite find the shape of it. What I saw through the window, Dr. Cross. She set the chart down and looked at him. You don't have to do this right now. I want to. It's almost 4 in the morning, and you've been in surgery for 2 hours. Brooks. He said it the same way he had in the corridor, the version of her name that was a question he didn't know how to finish. I've been working emergency medicine for 12 years, and I have never in my career seen a nurse, I've never seen anyone, do what you did tonight. She looked at him. He was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that comes from sustained concentration over hours, and his coat had a dried blood stain on the left sleeve from the surgery, and he looked for the first time in 14 months like a person rather than a position. You still have patience, she said. So do I. We can talk later. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went to his workstation. She went back to her chart. What? The witness's name, she learned at 4 a.m. from a federal agent who came down to update the staff on a need-to-know basis, was David Arlo. 43 years old. Former procurement officer with a defense contracting firm called Hargrove Solutions that had operated federal contracts for military equipment acquisition across 3 branches of service for 11 years. He had spent 8 months building a documentation case against a network of officials and company executives who had been systematically overbilling federal contracts, falsifying delivery records, and distributing bribes through shell accounts across 4 states. The total figure involved, the agent said, was in excess of $200 million. The agent said this in the flat, informational tone of someone delivering a briefing, and then he thanked the staff for their cooperation and left. Dara, who had been listening from the medication station, said quietly, 200 million. That's what he said. And they tried to kill him here, in this hospital. They tried, Emily said. Dara was quiet for a moment, then, is that why you have ice on your arm? Emily didn't answer that. She finished the chart she was on and moved to the next one. The rest of the shift passed in the ordinary way of post-surge early morning. A steady trickle of cases, nothing critical, the floor operating at the pace of a machine that had reset after a difficult hour. Emily worked through it. She was aware of a growing fatigue in her legs and a headache developing somewhere behind her left eye that was probably dehydration, and she drank 2 glasses of water from the break room and took something for the headache and kept going. At 5:40, the stairwell door opened and Mercer came through it. He looked worse than he had 3 hours ago. More tired, more worn, the contained urgency energy replaced by something that was working harder to stay contained. He found Emily at the far end of the nurses' station. The analyst, he said. He talked. She waited. The network didn't just know Arlo's location. They had access to the operational timeline. They knew the federal case was moving to charging within the next 2 weeks. He paused. Which means they weren't just trying to silence a witness. They were trying to collapse the case before it got to a grand jury. How many people does that implicate? 7 named individuals in the charging documents, 3 active duty officers, 2 executives at Hargrove Solutions, 1 congressional staffer. He set his jaw. And 1 federal prosecutor. Emily stilled. Inside the case, the prosecutor who was supposed to be presenting the evidence to the grand jury next week. He kept his voice low, measured. She's been with the case for 4 months. Emily processed this. It wasn't surprise exactly. The architecture of what she'd seen tonight had always suggested a bigger structure than 4 operatives and a corrupt analyst. But there was a difference between inferring a thing and hearing it confirmed, and she felt the weight of it in the specific way that comes from realizing how close it had all come to not mattering. The evidence Arlo has, she said, it's physical documentation, encrypted drives, physical documents, and a recorded testimony he gave in a secured session 6 weeks ago. We have duplicates in 2 separate federal secure facilities. So even if the case survives without him, but the testimony is more powerful with a living witness. He held her gaze. You kept the case alive tonight, not just Arlo, the whole thing. She picked up the chart she'd set down. I kept a patient alive. What the case does with that is someone else's work. Mercer studied her for a moment. The look on his face was the one she kept not quite being able to name, and she decided finally that it was what happened when someone encountered a person who did not want anything from what they'd just done. "There are going to be people who want to recognize you for this," he said. "They can send a card." "Emily, I work here," she said. "I have 4 more charts to finish before handoff. Is there something you need from me that's going to take less than 10 minutes? He almost said something. Instead, he reached into his jacket and put a card on the counter beside her. Not his own card this time, a plain white one with a direct line number written in ink. "If you think of anything else, or if anyone contacts you about tonight that isn't going through official channels." She looked at the card. "You think there's more?" "I think the prosecutor who was leaking to them has been making calls for 4 months. I think some of those calls were about contingencies." He paused. "I think tonight might not be the end of the operational side of this." She picked up the card, tucked it in her pocket. "Then make sure your people move fast," she said, and turned back to her chart. He left without another word, which was the right choice. At 6:15, the handoff shift started coming in. Emily briefed the oncoming nurses with the same efficiency she used every morning: patient statuses, pending labs, notable overnight events. The notable overnight events were, by mutual unspoken agreement between her and the charge staff, described as a security incident that had been handled and was now under federal management. The oncoming nurses looked at the bruise on her arm and the faint mark on her jaw and absorbed this characterization with varying degrees of credulity. She finished the handoff, returned the ice pack to the supply room, changed out of the scrubs she'd spent the last 9 hours in, and was almost at the locker room door when Cross caught up with her. He'd stayed. She hadn't expected that. "Brooks." He was holding a manila envelope. "The federal team left this for you. Statement copy, their process documentation. You'll probably hear from their office in the next week." She took the envelope. "There's something I need to say," he said, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. His voice was straightforward in the way it usually was. Directness was the one quality he had in full measure. And he met her eyes. "I have been dismissive of you since you started here. I told myself it was about your presentation, your approach, the way you carry yourself. I told other people it was about experience." He paused. "It wasn't. I didn't know what it was. I think I was wrong in ways I haven't worked out entirely yet." Emily looked at him. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not looking for you to tell me it's fine. I just need to say it." "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Yes." She looked at the envelope, then back at him. "Work on it." It was not absolution. She didn't have it to give, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. But it was the truth, and she'd always been more useful with the truth than with the alternatives. She went to her locker. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone lit up on the shelf. Not a call. A news alert from a local outlet she'd never subscribed to, but had somehow accumulated over the months. The headline read, "Federal agents descend on Silver Creek Medical Center in overnight operation. Multiple arrests made." Below it, a secondary line. Sources: arrests connected to defense contractor fraud case. Congressional staffer among those detained. She stared at the screen for a moment, and then, underneath the news alert, a text from an unknown number. No name, just 7 words. "They know the drives aren't at the facilities." Her hand stopped moving. She read it again. Turned the phone over, turned it back. The text was time-stamped 6:19 a.m., 4 minutes ago. The number was unregistered, the kind of burner that routes through 3 different carriers and drops off the grid the moment you try to trace it. She pulled Mercer's card from her jacket pocket. She looked at the card, looked at the text. The drives weren't at the facilities, which meant either the message was disinformation designed to make her, or Mercer's team, do something they could track, or it was true. And if it was true, then the evidence that the entire federal case rested on was somewhere nobody currently knew, and the people who'd sent 4 operatives into this hospital last night still had something left to lose. She pressed call on Mercer's number. It rang once, went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She stood in the locker room with her jacket half on and her phone in her hand and the message on the screen, and somewhere above her on the 3rd floor, David Arlo was waking up in a recovery room, not knowing that the thing he'd spent 8 months building was in a position she couldn't yet assess, and Mercer wasn't picking up, and the only person who had all the information needed to understand what was actually happening was her. She called a 3rd time. This time, it didn't even ring. The tech's name was Ricky, and he was 24 years old and had been working at Kessler Valley for 8 months, and he had never in his life moved as fast as he moved in the next 90 seconds. Emily didn't have to tell him twice about anything. That was the thing she noticed first. He read her hands, anticipated the next request before she finished the current one, and kept his mouth shut in the specific way that meant he was paying attention instead of managing his anxiety out loud. She filed that away. Good tech. Remember his name? The patient's vitals were degrading in the pattern she'd expected. Blood pressure drifting down in increments too small to alarm a standard monitor, but too consistent to be noise. She'd seen this exact progression twice before. Once in a forward operating base outside a city she wasn't authorized to name, and once in a converted field hospital that had officially been a supply depot. Both times, the margin between intervention and loss had been smaller than anyone watching would have believed. She worked. The first fragment was accessible. Upper left quadrant, embedded at a depth that allowed for extraction with minimal field disruption. She got it in 4 minutes. It came out clean, which was good, but the tissue around it was showing the early inflammation that meant the others weren't going to be as cooperative. She packed the site, updated the monitor settings, and moved. BP is 84/51, Ricky said. I know. She didn't look up from what she was doing. Get me a second line in his right antecubital and run the saline wide open. Don't push anything else until I tell you. Dr. Holt left orders for... I know what Dr. Holt's orders are. She finally looked up, briefly, directly at Ricky. Don't push anything else until I tell you. He nodded. He started the second line. The document the woman in civilian clothes had given her. She'd read it in 11 seconds, which was enough, because it was concise and she read fast. The patient's name was not something she'd been given. What she'd been given was his metabolic profile, a single flagged compound contraindication, and a notation about a rare clotting factor variation that appeared in approximately 0.3% of the population, and which would make a standard hemostatic agent interact with his system in a way that would accelerate the hemorrhage rather than control it. It would have looked, on a monitor, like a treatment failure rather than an iatrogenic event. Holt would have escalated. The escalation would have made it worse. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the window would have been closed. This was what the level 7 notation existed to prevent. This was what Richard Vance had decided was a staffing problem. She found the second fragment at 19 minutes. It was deeper than the imaging had suggested. The angle of entry had carried it further than a straight line projection would show, which was a characteristic of a specific category of projectile she'd been briefed on but had only encountered in the field once. She adjusted. She worked around a vascular structure that was angrier than it should have been at this stage, which meant inflammation was moving faster than expected, which meant she was out of the 30-minute cushion she'd given herself and was now working on something considerably tighter. Talk to me, she said to Ricky. BP is 81/48, heart rate 112. OX sat is holding at 94. Okay, she breathed. Okay, I need 2 units of packed red cells, and I need someone to pull up the specific blood type on this patient and cross it against the supply we have. Right now. Ricky got on the phone. Emily kept working. The third fragment was the problem. She'd known it would be. The imaging had shown the depth, and depth plus the clotting contraindication meant she was operating with a very specific set of tools she was not currently in a room with. She came up out of the wound and looked at the tray. I need a 4mm retrieval loop. Do you carry that here? Ricky looked at the tray. He looked at the supply cabinet. The expression on his face told her the answer before he said it. I don't think... Look in the bottom drawer of the secondary supply cart. The one by the... She stopped herself because she didn't know the layout of this room the way she knew the layout of other rooms. Which drawer has the endoscopic retrieval tools? I don't know if we have those. She thought for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time when she was thinking, because she didn't use any of them for anything except the problem. Then she said, get me an 18-gauge needle bent at a 20-degree angle and a hemostat with a jaw width under 3 millimeters. I can work with that. Ricky stared at her. Is that... It'll work. Go. He went. While he was gathering what she needed, she held pressure on the third site and ran through the mechanics in her head. This was something she'd learned from a surgeon named Wes Taggart, who had been working in conditions that made this trauma room look like an operating theater on a cruise ship, and who had told her once that improvisation wasn't a skill, it was a discipline, that you improvised correctly by understanding the principle so well that the tool became secondary. She'd thought he was being philosophical at the time. She understood now that he'd been being practical. Ricky came back with the needle and the hemostat. She looked at them. She bent the needle herself, a precise angle she could feel more than measure, and clamped it in the hemostat's jaw. "Hold the light steady," she said, "and don't move." He held it. He didn't move. She went in. What happened over the next 11 minutes was not graceful. She lost the fragment twice and had to reorient both times without rushing, because rushing with a bent needle in a compromised wound bed was how you turned a difficult situation into a catastrophic one. Her hands cramped once. The old injury in her shoulder radiated down into her forearm with the sustained position, and she paused for 4 seconds to let the muscle release before she continued. She was aware of the monitors and Ricky's periodic updates and the sound of voices outside the door. But she kept all of that at the edges of her attention, the way she'd learned to keep ambient noise in a forward position, present enough to register, far enough not to intrude. The fragment came free at the 31-minute mark. She stared at it for a moment. Small, dark, slightly irregular, in a way that confirmed what she'd suspected about its origin. Then she set it aside and packed the sight and said, "BP?" without looking up. 86/52, Ricky said. "Heart rate is coming down. 104. She nodded. She stripped her outer gloves, checked her work, and stood up straight for the first time in half an hour. Her back protested. Her shoulder was a sustained complaint. She ignored both. "He needs a transfusion, the units I ordered, and then a minimum of 4 hours of one-to-one monitoring with vital checks every 15 minutes. If his pressure doesn't hold above 90 systolic within the next 2 hours, I want to know immediately. Don't give him anything from the crash cart protocol without checking with me first." "I will," Ricky said. He paused. I've never seen. Document everything, every step, every intervention, every timestamp." She looked at him. "You did well." He looked surprised. She supposed people didn't say that to him often. She pushed through the trauma room door and walked back into the ER. The room had rearranged itself in her absence. The tactical personnel had spread their containment, 2 at the main entrance, 1 stationed at the corridor to the administrative wing, 1 she couldn't locate, which meant they were somewhere she wasn't seeing. The woman in civilian clothes was standing near the nursing station with a phone against her ear, and the expression of someone receiving information they weren't surprised by but weren't pleased about. The man in utilities, she still didn't know his name, was at the center of the room with Vance, and the conversation between them was the kind that didn't technically qualify as an argument because one of the parties had already lost and was still trying to speak. She heard Vance say, "Within my authority as administrator to make staffing determinations during a clinical..." The man in utilities said, "I understand what you're saying." The way he said it made Vance stop. Emily understood why. There was a specific intonation that people with certain kinds of experience used when they said "I understand," not as agreement, not as empathy, but as acknowledgement that they had received the information and were setting it aside. It was dismissal dressed as courtesy, and it was more final than anything louder would have been. She stopped a few feet from them and said, "Fragment 3 is out. He's hemodynamically tenuous but stable. He needs the transfusion to hold in consistent monitoring." The man in utilities turned to look at her. Something in his posture shifted in a way she wouldn't have been able to name but recognized. A recalibration, the way people adjusted when a variable changed in a direction they'd expected, but not confirmed. "You're sure about the extraction?" "I'm sure." "And the contraindication?" "Nothing from the crash protocol was administered. I confirmed with the tech before I started." He nodded, looked at Vance, looked back at Emily. "Thank you, Nurse Carter." The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. It landed in the room, and Vance felt it. She could see him feel it, the slight tightening around his jaw, the adjustment of his hands from loose at his sides to clasped in front of him, the unconscious management of an instinct to argue with something that no longer had an opening for argument. Donna Pruitt was standing at the edge of the nursing station, and Emily saw her watching. Donna had been charge nurse at this hospital for 9 years. She'd managed 2 previous administrators and had outlasted 1 departmental restructuring and 1 near accreditation failure, and she had survived all of it by reading situations accurately and backing the correct position early. Emily watched Donna read this situation. Donna looked at the tactical personnel at the entrance. She looked at the woman on the phone by the nursing station. She looked at the man in utilities who had just thanked Emily Carter by name and title in front of a room full of people who had spent 14 months treating Emily like she'd been placed there by mistake. Then Donna looked at Vance, and Emily watched the look go from assessment to conclusion in the space of about 2 seconds. Donna picked up a chart and found something very important to attend to. The woman in civilian clothes ended her call and walked over to the group. She introduced herself, finally, with a name, Agent Sandra Rowe, which told Emily something about which branch she represented without specifying further, and said, "We need to talk about the administrative decision that was made tonight." Vance said, "I'd like to have legal counsel present for any—" "That's your right," Rowe said, "and we can absolutely wait for counsel. We have time. What we're going to talk about isn't going anywhere." She looked at Emily. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her. Nobody in this building had asked her that in 14 months. "I'm fine," Emily said, which was mostly true. Her shoulder was bad, and she was tired in the deep way that came from sustained precision under pressure. And there was something sitting in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not triumph, not relief, something more complicated than either. "I need to check on the patient in an hour." "That's fine. You're not going anywhere tonight anyway." Rowe said it matter-of-factly, not as a threat but as information. "We're going to need a full account of what happened from the moment that patient was brought in." Emily thought about the documentation she'd entered into the chart before she'd been escorted to the break room. Time-stamped, thorough, specific. She thought about what it would look like alongside whatever Vance had entered or not entered in the same window. "That's already in the system," she said. Rowe looked at her. "All of it?" "Everything I observed from the moment he arrived, including the risk notation and the wound inconsistencies, including the time I flagged the imaging results and the time I was removed from the case." Rowe said nothing for a moment. Then, "Smart." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like recognition. Emily took it as such. The night continued past 4 a.m. with the particular unreality of nights that have been forced into a different shape than they started. The ER's regular population, the hourly additions of car trouble and chest pains and bad decisions, kept arriving at the entrance and being redirected by the tactical personnel with the kind of polite efficiency that allowed no discussion. The staff who had been on shift when the military arrived were all still present. Nobody had been permitted to leave, which was explained to them in a way that sounded optional and wasn't. Emily sat in the break room for 40 minutes and wrote out, in longhand on a legal pad that Rowe produced from a bag, a full account of the evening from her arrival at 11 to the moment she'd stepped out of the trauma room. She wrote it the way she'd been trained to write incident reports in another context. Factual, sequential, specific about time and observation, while precise about the distinction between what she'd seen and what she'd concluded from it. She crossed out 2 things and rewrote them because the first version was more interpretive than she wanted, and accuracy mattered more than narrative. When she was done, Rowe read it without comment. Then she set it face down on the table. "Your military record isn't in any system I'm permitted to access," Rowe said. "No," Emily agreed, "but your discharge documentation lists you as a civilian nurse with standard credentials." "Yes." "And you've been working here for 14 months." "Yes." Rowe looked at her with the particular expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces they don't have permission to name. "Why Ralston?" Emily looked at the wall across from her. There was a motivational poster on it, a photograph of a mountain range with a phrase about perseverance printed across the bottom in white text. She'd looked at that poster approximately 300 times in 14 months. She'd never found it motivating. "I needed somewhere quiet," she said. It was true. It wasn't the whole truth, but no part of it was false. Rowe didn't push. Emily noted that. People who knew when not to push were either trained very well or naturally perceptive, and Rowe seemed to be both. At 5:16 a.m., Emily went back to check on the patient. His pressure was holding, 92/58, which was not comfortable but was stable. His color was better than it had been. His breathing had settled into a pattern she recognized as real sleep rather than the enforced unconsciousness of before. Ricky was still there, still monitoring, looking exhausted in the way of someone who'd been running on adrenaline that was now metabolizing. "Has he said anything?" Emily asked. Not clearly. He said something about 20 minutes ago. Sounded like a name or a number. I couldn't tell." "What did it sound like?" Ricky thought about it. "Sounded like Pharaoh or Arrow, something like that." Emily kept her face very still. She said, "Document that too." She went back to the hallway. The man in utilities, she'd been given a name at some point, Commander Steele, which she'd tucked away, was in the corridor outside the trauma room talking in a low voice on a secure radio. She waited until he was done. "The patient said a word in his sleep," she said. "My tech documented it. It may be relevant to the people you're reporting to." Steele looked at her. "What word?" "Ricky documented it as Pharaoh." "I don't know if that's accurate. Partial consciousness isn't the most reliable communication channel." Something happened in Steele's face that he didn't completely control. It was brief, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional stillness, and then it was gone. "I'll note that," he said. His voice was perfectly even. She watched him walk back down the corridor, radio already at his ear. She thought, whatever Pharaoh is, it matters. And whatever it is, it's bigger than one wounded man in a Montana hospital. She stood in the corridor and felt the shape of something she couldn't see yet. The edge of a structure whose full dimensions were hidden, the way you could feel the presence of a large thing in a dark room before your eyes adjusted. She'd felt this before. In her experience, this feeling was a warning more than an intuition. She went back to the break room, sat down, and stared at the motivational poster until the mountain stopped looking like a mountain and started looking like an obstacle. At 6:45 a.m., the day shift began to arrive. This was its own kind of collision. The people who'd been here all night trying to brief the people just arriving, and the just arrived people trying to understand why there were armed tactical personnel at every entrance, and why Dr. Holt looked like he hadn't slept, and why Administrator Vance was sitting in a conference room down the hall with Agent Rowe and two people in suits who had arrived at some point and hadn't introduced themselves to anyone. Emily watched all of this from the nursing station where she was updating patient charts. Her own patients from earlier in the shift, the fracture and the fever, and the man with the chest pressure who had turned out to be fine, who had needed someone to sit with him, who probably didn't know what had happened in this hospital in the hours after his discharge. Donna Pruitt arrived at 7 a.m. and stopped at the nursing station. She looked at Emily. She looked at the charts Emily was updating. She looked at the situation around them. "How long have you been here?" Donna asked. "Since 11. Donna nodded slowly. "The patient in trauma 2 is stable, holding blood pressure. He needs monitoring for another minimum 3 hours before I'd feel comfortable about the trajectory. You're going to need to brief Dr. Kearney." Kearney was the day shift attending. Emily had interacted with him enough to know he was competent and non-defensive about receiving information from nursing staff, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been. "She's going to want to know the full picture." "I know." Emily paused. "All of my interventions are documented in the chart." Donna looked at her for a moment. Not the look she usually gave Emily. The sideways, assessing, vaguely skeptical look of someone waiting for a mistake, but something more direct than that, almost uncomfortable in its directness. "I heard what Vance did," Donna said. "Last night. I heard what happened." Emily waited. "I'm not going to pretend I've been—" Donna stopped, restarted. "I'm going to brief Kearney. You should get some rest." It was not an apology. Emily did not expect apologies from Donna Pruitt, and she wasn't sure she wanted one anyway. Not from this distance, not at 7 in the morning after a night like this one. What it was an acknowledgement. It was Donna confirming that she'd read the room correctly, that the position she'd calculated at 3 a.m. had resolved into the position she'd suspected, and that she was, in her particular practical way, adjusting accordingly. Emily appreciated practicality more than sentiment. She always had. "I'll brief Kearney first," Emily said. "Then I'll go." She spent 20 minutes with Dr. Kearney, who listened to everything, asked 3 precise questions, and then went directly to the trauma room without posturing or performing authority over information. Emily liked her immediately. She was collecting her things from her locker when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, not an area code she knew. She stared at it, let it ring, didn't answer. The voicemail notification appeared 30 seconds later. She almost didn't play it. She stood with her thumb over the notification and had a full conversation with herself about whether playing it was the right call. And the conversation ended the way those conversations usually ended for Emily, with the conclusion that not knowing was worse than knowing, and that she'd made decisions with worse information than whatever was in that message. She played it. The voice was male, older, with a quality of precision in the cadence that she associated with people who'd spent long periods of time in environments where inexactness had consequences. He said only 2 sentences. The first was, "We know where you are, and we know what you did tonight." The second was, "Stay away from the patient." The message ended. Emily stood in the locker room and listened to the silence where the voice had been. She played it again. She noted 3 things. The background ambient noise was institutional, not outdoor, probably a hallway or a waiting area. The voice had no regional accent, which meant it was suppressed or genuine, and she couldn't tell which. And the phrasing of the second sentence, "Stay away from the patient," was not a threat exactly. It was a warning delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the warning would be taken seriously. She stood very still. Then she forwarded the message to a contact in her phone listed only as a first name, Marcus, and typed below it, "This number. Tonight. Kessler Valley Medical. Someone is watching." She pressed send. She waited. No response. She put her phone in her jacket pocket, closed her locker, and walked out of the locker room. Down the corridor, past the nursing station, past the tactical personnel who nodded at her without speaking. Out through the ER entrance where the helicopter was no longer on the landing pad, and the rain from last night had become a gray, undecided morning. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 3 minutes. Then she went back inside. Because the patient's blood pressure was holding, but holding wasn't the same as stable, and there was a third possibility on the fragment trajectory she hadn't fully calculated yet, and she wasn't going to leave a patient she'd operated on, improvised or not, without being certain. And because whoever had left that message didn't know her well enough to know that stay away was not a direction she had ever been able to follow when something unfinished was on the other side of it. She badged back through the ER entrance. At the nursing station, she picked up the patient's chart. She was reading through the overnight notes when she noticed it. There was an entry at 5:52 a.m., 18 minutes before Ricky's handoff to the incoming day shift tech, that she didn't write and that didn't match Ricky's documentation style. It was a single line under the medication administration section. It listed a compound she hadn't ordered. It listed a dosage she hadn't authorized. The entry was logged under her ID number. Emily read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because she wanted to be absolutely certain that what she was reading was what she thought it was. Someone had added a fraudulent medication entry to the patient's chart using her credentials. If that entry was acted upon, if whoever treated the patient next read that chart and assumed the compound had been given and adjusted their protocol accordingly, the interaction with the patient's contraindicated clotting factor would produce exactly the crisis she'd spent 31 minutes preventing. She looked up from the chart. Across the ER, through the window of the trauma room, she could see the day shift tech. Not Ricky, someone she didn't know, reaching for the medication cart. She was already moving before she finished the thought. She hit the trauma room door at a run, which she didn't do. She didn't run in hospital corridors. Nobody who understood what running communicated to patients and families ran in hospital corridors. But she ran now because the day shift tech had the medication cart open and was reading from a printed protocol sheet and had his hand on a drawer. "Stop," she said. He stopped, looked at her. Young, maybe 22, with the startled expression of someone interrupted mid-task. "Don't touch anything in that cart yet." She crossed the room and put herself between him and the cart. "What are you drawing from?" The chart says there's a second dose of..." "I know what the chart says. Don't draw it." She looked at the patient, still sleeping. Pressure on the monitor reading 93/60, which was better than 2 hours ago. Color adequate. She looked back at the tech. What's your name? Garrett? Garrett, I need you to listen to me carefully. That entry in the chart is wrong. I don't know who put it there, but I did not order that compound and it was not administered. If you give it now, it will interact with this patient's system in a way that will look like a crash. Do you understand? Garrett stared at her. The entry is under your ID. I know. So you're saying I'm saying don't touch that cart. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were not entirely steady. I need you to step outside this room and find Agent Rowe. She's somewhere in this building. Civilian clothes, mid-40s, short hair. Find her and bring her here. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't mention the chart. I'm supposed to say, Garrett. She looked at him directly. Please. He left. Emily locked the medication cart with the key that was still in it, pocketed the key, and stood at the foot of the patient's bed and tried to think clearly through the exhaustion and the adrenaline and the particular cold sensation that had settled into her sternum when she'd read that fraudulent entry. Someone inside this hospital had done it. The entry required physical access to a workstation logged into the charting system, which required either a stolen credential or a compromised terminal. Her ID specifically, which meant someone had been watching her log in or had access to her credentials through another channel. The compound they'd chosen was not random. It required specific knowledge of this patient's contraindication to be dangerous in exactly the way it would have been dangerous, which meant the person who entered it knew the medical profile they were working against. This was not a mistake. This was not a systems error. Someone in this building wanted this patient dead and wanted it to look like Emily Carter had killed him. She heard Rose's voice in the corridor before she saw her, the clipped, purposeful cadence of someone who'd been running. And then Roe was in the doorway with Garrett 2 steps behind her and Commander Steele 4 steps behind him. Show me, Roe said. Emily pulled up the chart on the room's wall-mounted terminal. She pointed to the entry. Roe read it. Her face did not change expression, but something behind her eyes went very still in the way of someone making rapid calculations. What time was this entered? Steele asked from the doorway. 5:52 a.m. Emily pointed at the timestamp. Ricky's handoff was at 6:10, Steele said, not to Emily, but to Roe. 18-minute window, Roe said. Someone knew exactly when the room would be transitioning. She looked at Emily. You didn't come back into the building until 6:49. I have my badge in on record. Emily looked at her steadily. I wasn't here at 5:52. I know. Roe was already on her radio. I need an immediate audit of all terminal access in the Kessler Valley ER from 5:45 to 6:15 this morning. Every login, every ID, every keystroke. Right now. Static. Then an acknowledgement Emily couldn't fully hear. Steele moved into the room and looked at the patient. His expression was the controlled blankness of someone who'd been trained to manage their face. But Emily had spent enough time reading people in compressed, high-stakes situations to catch what was underneath it. He was scared. Not for himself. The specific fear of someone who is responsible for another person and has been reminded again of how many ways that responsibility can be taken from you. Is he safe right now? Steele asked her. For now, the compound wasn't administered. Emily looked at the locked cart. But if I hadn't come back, you did, Rose said. Flat, final. The next 20 minutes unfolded in a way that felt both very fast and strangely suspended. 2 of Steele's tactical personnel took up positions inside the trauma room rather than outside it, which changed the room's atmosphere in a fundamental way. It became something closer to what Emily had worked in overseas, the specific geometry of a protected space inside a hostile one. Rose's team pulled terminal access logs remotely, and within 9 minutes had an answer. Roe came back into the room with her phone in her hand and the expression of someone who'd expected bad news but hadn't expected it to be this specific. The entry was made from the terminal in the administrator's office, she said, logged under Emily Carter's ID. The administrator's office was accessed at 5:49 a.m. using an override key that belongs to one person in this hospital. Nobody said the name. They didn't need to. Emily thought about Vance in the conference room. Vance, who'd been sitting with Rose's colleagues since before 4 a.m. Vance, who would have known exactly what an untreated secondary interaction would produce. Vance, who had, she understood it now, not as suspicion, but as assembled fact, known more about that patient than an administrator responding to an emergency transfer had any reason to know. He had access to the patient's medical profile before I did, she said. He knew about the contraindication. Rowe looked at her. Explain. When he appeared in the trauma room, the first time before I was removed, he looked at the wrist notation and called it a personal tattoo, immediately, without hesitation. Emily heard her own voice going flatter as she spoke, the affect compressing itself the way it did when she was assembling a case rather than having a conversation. He didn't look at it long enough to read it. He just identified it as irrelevant and moved on. You do that when you already know what you're looking at is dangerous and you want it dismissed. Rowe was quiet for a moment. The radio on her hip crackled once, and she silenced it. Richard Vance was flagged in a financial audit 14 months ago, Rowe said, and the way she said it, the careful, deliberate specificity, told Emily that this was not information being freely given, but rather information being offered in exchange for something Rowe wanted confirmed. An audit connected to a contract between this hospital and a private logistics company. The company has 3 shell subsidiaries registered in 2 different states and 1 overseas territory. 14 months ago. Emily had arrived in Ralston 14 months ago. She thought about the quiet she'd come here for, the distance, the small hospital in a small town where she'd believed, had needed to believe, that she was simply a nurse and that was enough, and that the things she'd done and known and carried from before could stay before. He's been protecting a pipeline, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe so. Rowe looked at the patient on the bed. And we believe the man in this room has information about where that pipeline ends. The compound in the chart. The phone call. Stay away from the patient. The pieces had been in front of her all night, and now they arranged themselves into something with edges. Vance didn't just try to remove me from the case, Emily said. He tried to use me as the mechanism. If that compound had been administered, the chart would show I ordered it. Yes. And I'd have no defense because my actual background isn't in any system anyone at this level can access. No, Rowe said. You wouldn't. Emily stood with that for a moment. The room was quiet except for the monitors and the low, continuous sound of the tactical personnel's radio traffic and the patient's steady breathing. Then Steele's radio, a different one, larger, not the standard tactical unit, made a sound she hadn't heard in 6 years. A specific tone, 3 descending notes, that belonged to a communications protocol she'd been briefed on in the same building where she'd learned the Level 7 notation. Steele answered it. He listened for 40 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Confirmed," and lowered the radio. He and Rowe exchanged a look that Emily couldn't read in its entirety, but the part she could read told her the situation had just grown by at least 1 order of magnitude. "What's Pharaoh?" Emily asked. Neither of them answered immediately. Then Steele said, "Pharaoh is an operation, or it was." He looked at her with the expression of someone revising a calculation in real time. "The man in that bed is not a soldier." Emily waited. "He's a federal prosecutor, and 3 days ago he disappeared from protective custody with evidence that would dismantle the largest medical procurement fraud network active on the eastern seaboard." Steele's voice was steady. What was underneath it was not. "We've been looking for him for 72 hours. We didn't know he'd made it this far." The silence in the room lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then every radio in the building went off at once. The radios didn't all carry the same traffic. Emily understood that within the first 15 seconds, Steele's large unit was pulling from a different channel than the tactical personnel's earpieces, and Rowe's phone had lit up simultaneously with a call she stepped away to take, which meant 3 separate communication streams had activated at once, which meant whatever was happening was not contained to this room or this building or this town. Steele was on his radio with the flat, rapid precision of someone translating incoming information into outgoing orders in real time. She caught fragments. Eastern perimeter. Confirm the vehicle. A pause. Don't move on it yet. Another pause. Longer. Where's the second unit? Emily looked at the patient. At the prosecutor, she corrected herself, though the category shift was strange and she was still absorbing it, and watched his monitors and tried to assess whether his current stability was robust enough to survive whatever was about to happen to this room. It wasn't ideal. 93/60 was holding, but it was holding the way a door held against pressure. Functional until the pressure changed. "I need to know if we're moving him," she said to Steele, loudly enough to cut through the radio traffic. He held up a hand. Not dismissive. The specific gesture of someone who needed 4 more seconds and was asking for them rather than commanding them. She waited 4 seconds. "We don't know yet," he said. "There's a vehicle that was parked on the service road behind this building. It wasn't there at 0200. It is there now." "How long?" Thermal showed it active as of 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago, she'd been in the parking lot. She thought about the 3 minutes she'd sat in her car, staring through the windshield at the gray morning, and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "If we move him and he destabilizes en route," she started. "I know. His pressure is not—" "I know, Nurse Carter." Steele looked at her directly. "I need 5 minutes to establish whether the threat is mobile or static. If it's static, we hold position. If it's mobile, we have to make a decision I don't want to make." She understood that. She nodded. Ro came back into the room. She'd ended her call, and there was something different about her posture. Not tenser exactly, but reorganized. The way people looked when a situation had clarified into a shape they recognized even if the shape wasn't good. "That was DOJ," she said. "They've been running a parallel investigation into the procurement network for 8 months. Farrow," she glanced at the patient, corrected herself as Emily had, "the prosecutor, his name is Daniel Weiss. He was scheduled to deliver a sealed evidentiary package to a federal grand jury in Helena on the 14th, 3 days ago." "Today is the 14th, Emily said. "Yes." Ro let that land. "He was taken from protective custody on the 11th. 2 marshals were injured. The package wasn't recovered with him, which means he either hid it before they got to him or it's still in transit somewhere. DOJ believes he's been trying to get to Helena on his own." Emily thought about the wounds, the lacerations, the fragments, the bilateral bruising. A man moving through hostile territory for 3 days with injuries he couldn't report without exposing himself, making it as far as Ralston, Montana, before his body stopped cooperating. "He drove himself here," she said. "We think so. There's a vehicle registered to a shell company in the hospital's east lot. It's been there since approximately 1:30. He walked into an ER controlled by the man who's part of the network he's been investigating." The room was quiet for a moment with the particular weight of a terrible coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all, because Weiss had known, on some level, that he was running out of time and options, and had picked the nearest point of medical intervention without knowing what it was, or who ran it, or how deep the connection went. Or maybe he had known and had come anyway. Emily thought about that. She thought about what it took to walk into a place you knew was dangerous because the alternative was dying in a car on a service road. She thought she understood that particular calculus. "Vance," she said, "is still in the conference room," Rose said, "with 2 of my colleagues and his very recently arrived attorney." A pause. "The attorney's name is Gordon Fisk. He flew in from Billings at 5 a.m. Vance called him before 5 a.m.? Before 4:30. Before we'd told him anything specific about why we were here." Ro looked at her. "He made the call from a hospital landline at 4:17. 4:17 was 12 minutes after Commander Steele had thanked Emily in the ER corridor. 12 minutes after Vance had been in that room and understood, from the way the situation had reorganized around Emily Carter, that the version of events he'd been managing was no longer the version in play. "He knew then that it had gone wrong," Emily said. "Yes, and at 5:49 he went to the administrator's office and used my credentials to add the chart entry." "Yes." The sequence assembled itself completely. Vance had spent the hour between 4:17 and 5:17 calling his attorney and thinking through his position. He'd understood that the patient, Weiss, couldn't be allowed to stabilize and talk. He'd understood that eliminating Weiss directly, inside a building now occupied by federal agents and tactical personnel, was not possible. So he'd found a different mechanism, a medication error, logged under the credentials of the nurse who'd been removed from the case under documented circumstances that made her look like a problem. The nurse whose intervention had, from Vance's perspective, disrupted everything. It was methodical. It was the thinking of someone who'd been managing risk for a long time and had gotten practiced at it. It would have worked if Emily hadn't come back. She thought about what had made her come back. The unfinished calculation, the fragment trajectory she hadn't fully resolved, the inability to leave something open when she had the capacity to close it. She'd called it professional obligation, and it was that, but it was also something more personal than that. The particular stubbornness of someone who'd spent 14 months being told that her presence was optional and had never once believed it. Steele finished his radio communication and turned to face them both. The vehicle on the service road has a second occupant. Thermal shows 2 individuals. One appears stationary, one is mobile within the vehicle. Waiting for confirmation, Rowe said. Not a question. Waiting for Wise to either die from the chart entry or for the entry to be discovered and create enough legal chaos to require a transfer, at which point Steele stopped. At which point the transfer becomes the window. Emily looked at Garrett, who had been standing near the door with the stunned expression of someone who'd clocked in for a routine shift and had been inside a federal operation for 40 minutes. Go to the nursing station, she told him. Don't discuss anything you've heard. I'll come find you. He left with visible relief. What do you need from me right now? She asked Rowe. Weiss's status. Specifically, if we need to move him in the next 30 minutes, what does that look like? Emily turned back to the monitors. She ran through the numbers. 93/60, heart rate 98 now, oxygen saturation 95. The transfused units had done their work. The extraction sites were packed, and the tissue integrity, as far as she could assess without imaging, was holding. He hadn't spiked a temperature, which was the thing she'd been watching for. Fever in the first 8 hours post-extraction would indicate a complication she couldn't manage in a moving vehicle. 30 minutes is possible, she said. I'd want a transport nurse with him, and I'd want a line running continuously. If his pressure drops below 85 systolic at any point during transport, whoever's with him needs to know to stop and call it in immediately rather than push through. She paused. And I want to know where he's going before he leaves this room. Rowe looked at her. That's not standard. He's my patient. She said it simply. I operated on him with a bent needle and a hemostat in a hospital where someone just tried to kill him using my credentials. I'm asking where he's going. A beat. Helena Regional, Rowe said. We have a secured floor. Emily nodded. It was 2 hours by road in good conditions. Not ideal. Possible. The next phase of the morning had a different texture than everything before it. Faster in some ways, strangely administrative in others. Rowe's team moved on the vehicle on the service road at 7:43 a.m., while Emily was preparing Weiss for transfer, and she heard the radio confirmation from across the room. 2 individuals detained, no resistance, no weapons discharged, and felt something in her chest release a fraction of pressure she hadn't fully registered she'd been carrying. She learned later from Rowe that the 2 individuals in the vehicle were employees of one of the Shell subsidiaries connected to Kessler Valley's procurement contracts. Neither of them had medical backgrounds. They'd been told only that a transfer would be arranged, and that their job was to intercept it. Weiss left the building at 8:11 a.m. on a gurney with a transport nurse named Felicia beside him, an IV running, and a continuous monitor attached. Emily stood at the ambulance bay and watched the doors close. She'd written a transfer summary that covered everything she'd done and everything she'd observed and everything the receiving team needed to know, and she'd handed it to Felicia with the specific instruction to read it before they reached the highway, rather than after. Felicia, who had the competent, unfussy manner of someone who'd done 100 transfers and didn't need to be told to take her job seriously, said, "Okay." Then she looked at Emily more carefully. "You look like you've been here all night." "Since 11, Emily said. "Go home." Felicia said it the way Emily had said things to Garrett. Not unkind, just direct. "We've got him." The ambulance pulled out. Emily watched it until it turned onto the main road and was gone. Inside, the hospital was reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. Rowe's team had expanded. 2 additional agents had arrived sometime around 7:30, and they moved through the building with the specific purposefulness of people executing a search protocol that had already been authorized. The administrator's office was sealed. The conference room where Vance had been sitting was no longer a conference room so much as a formal interview room, and the sounds that came from it, muffled, periodic, with long silences between, had the rhythm of a conversation that was not going Vance's direction. Emily found Steele in the corridor outside the sealed administrator's office. "The chart entry," she said. "Is it enough?" Steele looked at her. He understood what she was asking. Is accessing a patient's chart using stolen credentials and adding a fraudulent medication order that would have caused the patient's death, is that prosecutable? Or is it something that gets managed into ambiguity? With the terminal access logs and the badge record showing he was in the building at 5:49 and you weren't, Steele said, yes, and that's before the procurement fraud and the connection to Weiss's custody breach. He paused. It's enough. She nodded. He looked at her for a moment with the same expression he'd had in the trauma room, that recalibration, that adjustment. When you were briefed in Virginia, he said, on the Level 7 protocol, how old were you? 23. And you remembered it. I remember everything I'm briefed on. She said it without pride because it wasn't pride. It was a fact about how her memory worked, which had been useful in certain contexts and isolating in others. It's not a skill. It's just how I'm built. Steele was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need a formal statement from you about the chart entry, about the withdrawal of your credentials, about the full clinical sequence from intake to transfer. He paused. It will be thorough, and it may take most of today. I know. And then he stopped. I'd like to have a different conversation with you. Not today, when this is settled. She looked at him. About what? About what you've been doing in Ralston for 14 months. He said it without judgment, but also without softness. And whether that's where you want to stay. Emily thought about the motivational poster in the break room, the mountain that looked like an obstacle, the bad coffee from the broken machine, the way Donna Pruitt had looked through her for over a year before last night, reorganized her understanding of where Emily Carter stood. I'm not going anywhere today, she said. I know. He almost, not quite, but almost, smiled. Neither is Vance. She spent the rest of the morning in a formal interview room with 2 agents and a recording device and a cup of coffee that was, inexplicably, quite good. She gave her statement in the same way she'd written the longhand account for Roe, factual, sequential, precise, about the distinction between observation and conclusion. It took 3 hours and 20 minutes. She asked for 1 bathroom break. She did not ask for anything else. At 12:40 p.m., Roe knocked on the interview room door and stepped inside. Vance's attorney has filed for an emergency injunction to block the chart access audit, she said. It was denied 40 minutes ago. She set a printout on the table in front of Emily. And Weiss arrived in Helena. He's stable. His pressure held the whole way. Emily looked at the printout. It was a fragment of the terminal access log, the specific entry that showed Vance's administrator override at 5:49 a.m., the login under Emily's ID, the compound entered and saved. His attorney is arguing it could have been a systems error, Roe said, that the credentials were compromised without Vance's involvement. The badge record shows him in the building, Emily said. It shows him in the administrator's office. It doesn't show him at the terminal. Surveillance? The camera in the administrator's office has been malfunctioning since August. Rose said it with the particular tone of someone who found this unsurprising. Work order submitted in September, not yet repaired. Emily understood. Not proof of tampering, could be bureaucratic delay, could be budget, could be genuine malfunction. But the timing of an unrepaired camera in the administrator's own office, combined with everything else, was a data point that would be considered. What about the phone call at 4:17? Emily asked. Before we told him anything. His attorney is arguing he panicked when military personnel arrived at his hospital and called legal counsel as a precaution. Rose's voice was absolutely neutral. Which is a right he has. Emily looked at the table. She understood what Roe was telling her, which was not that Vance was going to escape consequences, but that the path to consequences was not going to be clean. It was going to be the kind of legal proceeding that took months and generated paperwork and made people who'd done terrible things look, temporarily, like people caught in a procedural dispute. She'd known this. She'd known it from the moment she understood what she was dealing with. Clean endings were for situations with fewer lawyers. The procurement fraud, she said. That's the larger case. 8 months of documentation, Rowe confirmed. Billing irregularities, ghost contracts, falsified vendor credentials. The preliminary figure is somewhere north of $4 million across 6 facilities, Kessler Valley being the largest single node. She paused. Vance was not the architect. He was a facility operator, someone who agreed to manage a node in exchange for a percentage and protection. Who's the architect? Rowe looked at her in a way that answered the question without answering it. Not something I'm going to tell you right now. Emily accepted that. It wasn't her case. She was a nurse. She had been, that morning, very briefly something more than a nurse. But that moment had passed, and what remained was the factual situation of what she did and where she stood. She was about to say something else when one of the agents in the room received a notification on his tablet and looked up with the expression of someone reading something unexpected. Vance just recanted the preliminary statement he gave at 4 a.m., the agent said. His attorney has filed a formal complaint against Agent Rowe and Commander Steele for coercive interviewing and is threatening a civil suit against the hospital on his behalf. The room was quiet. Emily looked at Rowe. Rowe's jaw had tightened by exactly the amount that represented the difference between a person who was in control of their reaction and a person who was in control and angry about what they were controlling. He's repositioning, she said. He understands the chart entry is a problem, so he's going on offense to create noise around the investigation. Will it work? Emily asked. It'll create delay. Rowe straightened. It won't change where this ends. Emily thought about delay. She thought about Weiss in a secured room in Helena, stable, alive, with evidence that had apparently survived whatever 3 days of hostile custody had done to him. She thought about the terminal log and the badge record, and the 18-character notation on Weiss's wrist, and the improvised retrieval tool she'd built from a bent needle and a hemostat. She thought about Richard Vance sitting in a conference room telling a story that put him at the center of a reasonable misunderstanding. And then her phone buzzed. The contact listed as Marcus. She hadn't heard from him since she'd forwarded the voicemail at 5:30 a.m. She picked up the phone and looked at the message. The number that called you belongs to a burner purchased in Billings on October 9th. Payment traced to a corporate account. Account is registered to Fisk Legal Group. Gordon Fisk, Vance's attorney. The attorney who'd flown in at 5 a.m. called before 4:30 and was now filing civil complaints to create procedural noise, had also been the source of the phone call that told Emily to stay away from the patient. Fisk hadn't been flying in to represent Vance. He'd been in communication with Vance and with the people watching the building since before Vance even called him. He wasn't damage control. He was part of the infrastructure. She looked up from her phone at Rowe. I need to show you something, she said, and then you need to make a call before Fisk files anything else. She handed Rowe the phone. Rowe read the message. Her face did not change in any way that would have been visible to a casual observer. To Emily, who had been watching faces in compressed situations for years, the change was specific and significant. The eyes went from the controlled neutrality of a field agent managing a complex situation to something colder and more focused, the look of someone who has just seen the perimeter of a problem expand outward in a direction they hadn't fully accounted for. Marcus, Rowe said. Who is Marcus? Emily looked at her steadily. Someone I trust. Rowe looked at the message again. Then she looked at Emily. Then she walked out of the room with her phone already at her ear, and the door fell shut behind her. And the 2 remaining agents looked at each other and then at Emily with the particular expression of people who understood that the situation had just changed, but didn't yet know in which direction. Emily put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. Somewhere in this building, Gordon Fisk was drafting civil complaints on behalf of a man who had tried to kill a federal prosecutor and frame a nurse for it. Somewhere in Helena, Daniel Weiss was in a secured room with evidence that could dismantle a network that had been operating for years. Somewhere in Billings, or beyond it, there was an architect that Rowe hadn't named and that Marcus apparently had. She thought, how far does this go? And then she heard, through the closed door, a sound she'd been hearing all morning, the controlled urgency of radio traffic, but different this time. More of it. Multiple units activating simultaneously, which was the sound of a perimeter response, which meant something was moving that wasn't supposed to be moving. She stood up. One of the agents in the room said, you should stay. The door opened. Rose stood in the frame with the phone still in her hand and an expression that was no longer controlled. "Weiss is awake," she said. "He's been awake for 40 minutes, and he's been talking." Emily waited. "He didn't come to Kessler Valley by accident." Rose's voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing a lot of work. "He knew it was connected to the network. He came here deliberately, with documentation embedded in his person. Not a package, not a drive, not anything we were looking for." A pause. "Before he lost consciousness in his car on that service road, he made a phone call." "To who?" "To the FBI field office in Helena. He told them where he was going and why." Roe looked at her. "He told them there was a nurse at this hospital who would either get him out or document the attempt to stop her from doing so. He had your name, Emily. He had your name before he ever came through those ER doors." The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the agent by the window said, very quietly, "Roe, Vance is gone." Roe turned. The agent was looking at his tablet. On the screen was a feed from the hospital's exterior camera network, the south entrance, the one that faced the parking lot, the one Emily had walked back through at 6:49 a.m. The timestamp in the corner read 1:04 p.m. On the screen, a silver sedan was moving toward the exit. In the back seat, visible through the window for exactly 2 seconds before the vehicle turned, was the silver hair and the too straight posture of Richard Vance. Roe was on her radio before the car completed the turn. Emily watched the empty road on the screen where the sedan had been. She thought about what Roe had just told her. Weiss had known her name. He'd come here knowing she was here, which meant someone had told him, which meant there was a thread connecting her presence in this town to a federal investigation she hadn't known existed, and that thread had been running parallel to her for 14 months without her knowledge. The quiet she'd come to Ralston to find. The distance she'd believed she'd put between herself and everything that came before. It had never been distance at all. They found the silver sedan 11 minutes later, 3 blocks from the hospital, engine running, driver's door open. The driver, one of Fisk's associates, it turned out, a man named Toller who had been posing as a legal aid, was sitting on the curb with his hands on his knees when the tactical unit arrived. And he did not resist, which told Emily something about the difference between people who believed in what they were doing and people who'd been paid to be adjacent to it. Vance was not in the car. He was in the hospital. This was the thing that took another 22 minutes to establish, and in those 22 minutes the building went through a controlled lockdown that looked, from the inside, like a very organized version of panic. Doors secured, staff directed to designated areas, patients who could be moved were moved, patients who couldn't weren't. Emily spent those minutes in the corridor outside the sealed administrator's office because it was a central point, and because she needed to be somewhere she could see what was happening rather than somewhere she was being managed. Steele found Vance in the hospital's basement at 1:31 p.m. He was in the records room. The physical records room, the one that housed paper documentation from before the hospital's digital transition, boxes and folders and binders going back 22 years. He had a box open on the table in front of him, and he was pulling files when Steele's team came through the door. Roe told Emily this afterward, and described Vance's expression as focused, which Emily thought was probably accurate. He wasn't panicking, he was calculating. He'd understood in the 12 minutes between the sedan leaving and the lockdown completing that his exit had failed, and he'd pivoted to the next available option, which was removing whatever physical documentation remained in that building before federal agents got to it. He destroyed 4 folders before Steele reached him. He was charged that afternoon with obstruction, evidence tampering, and attempted flight, added to the existing documentation around the chart entry and his connection to Fisk and the men on the service road. The federal prosecutor handling the case, not Weiss, who was still in a secured medical facility in Helena, but a colleague who had been briefed on everything, told Roe that the destroyed files were unlikely to be critical because most of the relevant financial documentation had already been imaged during the preliminary audit 14 months ago. 14 months ago. When Emily had arrived in Ralston, she thought about that. She thought about it again that evening, sitting in her apartment for the first time in what felt like a different version of her life, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has run a very long distance and has only now stopped moving long enough to understand how far they've come. The apartment was small and tidy, in the specific way of someone who didn't accumulate things, a habit from years of living in places where accumulation meant weight you'd eventually have to carry. A bookshelf, mostly medical references and a few novels she'd read twice. A kitchen table she used as a desk. A window that looked out at the edge of Ralston's main street, which at 8 p.m. was quiet in the way small towns were quiet. Not empty, but settled, finished with the day. Her phone had 47 unread messages. She'd read 11 of them and stopped. She made coffee, which she didn't need and drank anyway, and sat at the table and tried to organize what she knew into a shape that made sense. Weiss had known her name. That was the piece she kept returning to. Someone had told a federal prosecutor running a protected investigation into a multi-facility fraud network, that there was a nurse in Ralston, Montana, at one of the network's primary nodes, who had a background that made her specifically equipped to handle what he'd need if he made it that far. Someone had decided at some point in the last 14 months that Emily Carter's presence in this town was not incidental. She had 3 guesses about who Marcus had told. She didn't pursue any of them tonight. What she knew, concretely, was this. Weiss was alive. The evidence he'd carried, embedded in a waterproof medical adhesive patch on his lower back, which Felicia the transport nurse had found during the transfer prep, and which contained a microdrive holding 14 months of financial documentation, had been received by the Helena field office at approximately 10 a.m. The grand jury that had been waiting since October 11th had reconvened at 2 p.m. Rowe had told her this in a text at 6:30, which was the most informal communication they'd had. The rest of it, the full scope of the network, the architect Rowe hadn't named, the 6 facilities and $4 million, and the shell companies in 2 states and an overseas territory, that was the work of other people now. Emily had handed Weiss to Felicia at the ambulance bay, and Felicia had said, "We've got him," and that was where Emily's direct involvement ended. She was trying to decide how she felt about that when her phone rang. Not Marcus, not Rowe. A number she recognized because she'd looked at it enough times in the past few years to have memorized it, despite never calling it, which was the kind of thing she did without deciding to. She answered. "Emily?" The voice was older than she remembered, or she was hearing it differently now. "I heard you had a long night." The General Patricia Oakes had retired 18 months ago from a position that didn't appear in any public record. She had a house in Colorado and a habit of calling people she'd trained at times that suggested she hadn't entirely retired from thinking like the person she used to be. "General," Emily said, "it's Patricia now. I've asked you before." Patricia. It still felt strange. Some categories of address didn't reassign easily. "Did you know he was coming here?" A pause. Not a surprised pause. A considered one. "I knew Weiss had your name. I didn't know what he'd decide to do with it." "Did you give it to him?" "I gave it to someone who gave it to someone." Another pause. "I thought you should know that Weiss specifically requested you. He'd read the preliminary audit. He knew Kessler Valley was the largest node. He knew that if he didn't make it to Helena and the operation depended on what he could do at point of crisis, he wanted someone at that hospital who wasn't part of the system he was documenting." Emily thought about that. About being a contingency in someone else's plan without knowing it. About the 14 months she'd spent being looked through in a hospital that turned out to be wired into a federal fraud network, doing her job, documenting her observations, filing her timestamps, building a record that turned out to matter in ways she hadn't known. "You could have told me," she said. "I could have," Patricia said. "And you would have left." Emily opened her mouth, closed it. She thought about whether that was true and concluded, honestly, that it probably was. She'd come to Ralston for quiet. If she'd known the quiet was a cover for something else, she'd have found a different kind of quiet. She'd have run from the usefulness, which was the thing she'd been running from for 14 months without knowing that's what it was. "I'm tired of being someone's contingency," she said. "I know." Patricia's voice was even, not apologetic, but not dismissive. "That's not what I'm calling to offer you." Emily waited. "Steele filed a request this morning to have your service record reviewed for a consultancy position. It's not military, technically. It's a joint medical oversight role that works with both federal investigators and military medical teams. It's based in Helena. It's not classified, which means you'd be visible in a way you haven't been." A pause. "It means people would know who you are and what you've done." Emily looked at the window. The main street of Ralston, Montana. Quiet and ordinary at 8 p.m. The edge of a life she'd assembled from components she'd chosen for their smallness, because smallness had felt for a while like safety. "I don't need people to know," she said. "I know you don't need it," Patricia said. "I'm asking if you want it." She didn't answer immediately. She sat with the question, which was not really about the job or the title or the visibility. It was about whether she was done trying to take up less space than she occupied, done calibrating herself to fit inside other people's assessments of what she was and what she could be trusted to handle. She thought about Ricky, the 24-year-old tech who'd held the light steady and not moved. She thought about Garrett, who'd gone to find Roe when she asked him to. She thought about Weiss in his car on a service road, injured and running out of options, making decisions about who to trust with the last available calculation he had. She thought about herself at 2:47 a.m., watching 8 soldiers come through a rain-streaked window, knowing before any of the conscious analysis caught up that she was the only person in that building who understood what was walking through the door. She hadn't been a contingency then. She'd been a fact. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's more than you usually give me," Patricia said, and ended the call. The public part of it began 3 days later and was messier than Emily had expected, which meant it was approximately as messy as things actually were, and she'd been wrong to expect otherwise. Richard Vance was formally arrested on October 17th. The charges filed against him were read in open court: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and 1 count of attempted second-degree murder. The chart entry, framed through the lens of what the compound would have done to Daniel Weiss's system and the specificity of knowledge required to construct the intervention. His attorney, Gordon Fisk, was arrested the same morning on separate charges related to his role as a communications conduit between Vance and the network's operational layer. Fisk's arrest happened at his office in Billings, which meant it happened in front of his staff and his client's representatives, and by noon it was on the local news, and by 4 p.m. it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. Emily watched none of this in real time. She heard about it from Roe, who texted her a case number and a court date and the words "you'll be called as a witness," probably February, in the same message. She was at Kessler Valley when the news broke, because she was still scheduled for shifts and she showed up to them because patients were still sick, regardless of what had happened to the administrator. The nursing station had a different quality to it now. Not warmer exactly, but less pressurized, the way a room felt when a sound you'd stopped consciously noticing finally stopped. Donna Pruitt managed the floor with the same practiced efficiency as always, but she spoke to Emily directly now, asking rather than directing, listening to the answer. It was a small adjustment. Emily noticed it. Dr. Holt was harder. He was not a corrupt man. She'd had time to establish that clearly. And it mattered to her because painting with a wide brush was the kind of imprecision she disliked in clinical contexts and in people reading both. He was a man who had been complacent in his own authority, who had used condescension as a management tool for so long that it had become structural, part of the way he moved through his working day. That didn't make him guilty of anything except being the particular kind of doctor that hospitals produced in abundance: competent, defended, and slow to update. He stopped her in the corridor on October 18th, the day after the arrests. "The fragment extraction," he said. "What you did." She waited. "I've been thinking about the improvised retrieval." He said it with the careful cadence of someone who is working against an instinct. I don't know the procedure you adapted it from, but the principle was sound. Given the contraindication, it was the right call. It wasn't an apology, it was an acknowledgement, which from Marcus Holt was probably more costly. She took it as such. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked away, and they both let it be what it was. On October 21st, the hospital board convened an emergency session. Emily was not in the room, but the outcome reached her through the official channel. An email from the interim administrator, a woman named Dr. Carol Spence, who'd been brought in from the Regional Health Authority and who communicated in the direct, unsentimental style of someone who'd been cleaning up after other people's disasters for a long time. The email contained 3 things: a formal acknowledgement that Emily's removal from the trauma room on October 14th had been improper and harmful to patient safety, a statement that all documentation from that event had been corrected to accurately reflect the clinical sequence, and an offer, a real one in writing, for Emily to move from her current rotation into the newly created position of Emergency Response Coordinator, effective the 1st of November. The position had not existed before October 14th. It would involve clinical protocol development, staff training in mass casualty and high acuity situations, and direct coordination with regional emergency services. It paid significantly more than her current rate. It came with authority to override clinical decisions that endangered patient safety, which was language that had been put into the job description deliberately, she understood, by someone who knew what had happened and wanted to make certain it couldn't happen the same way again. She read the email 3 times. Then she went back to work and read it a 4th time on her break. On October 24th, she went to Helena, not for the investigation that was ongoing, and her formal witness statement had already been given, but because Daniel Weiss had asked to see her. The request came through Rowe, who passed it along without commentary, which meant Rowe thought it was worth doing. The secured floor at Helena Regional was quieter than Kessler Valley had been on its quietest shift. A different texture of quiet, monitored, controlled, with the specific stillness of a place where the people inside it were valuable and the people outside were aware of this. A federal marshal checked her ID at the elevator and again at the floor entrance, and she let him and didn't take it personally. Weiss was sitting up when she came in. He was 41, with the particular thinness of someone who'd lost weight recently and hadn't had time to recover it, and dark eyes that tracked her from the doorway with a sharpness that told her he'd been doing this, assessing, calculating, reading rooms, for a very long time. His color was better than it had been on October 14th. Significantly better, which meant the pressure had held, and the fragments had been all of it, and there were no delayed complications she needed to worry about. She stood at the foot of his bed and did a clinical scan out of habit, and then made herself stop, because she was here for a different reason. "Emily Carter," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. The aftermath of the tube that had been placed during transport, probably, or just general damage from 3 days of moving while injured. "Mr. Weiss." "Dan." He shifted slightly against the pillow. "I'm told you used a bent needle and a hemostat. Rose said you had 20 minutes. Closer to 30. I wasn't precise about it at the time." Something happened in his face that was the beginning of a smile, and then reconsidered itself. "I knew you were there. I knew someone was there. I could hear you talking to the tech. I couldn't hear the words, just the cadence." He paused. "It was calm. You sounded calm." "I've learned to sound calm," she said. "It's not the same thing." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I imagine it isn't." She pulled the chair from the corner of the room. It scraped against the linoleum, an ordinary sound, and sat down. They were quiet for a moment, 2 people who had shared a crisis from different angles and were now sitting in the ordinary aftermath of it, which was always stranger than the crisis itself. "Someone told you I'd be there," she said. "Yes." "Did they tell you why I was there?" "In Ralston." "They told me you needed somewhere quiet." He said it without any particular weight, just information. "They told me you were someone who'd done significant things and had chosen to do a smaller thing for a while, and that if I made it to that hospital, I should ask for you by name." She thought about that, about what it meant that her choice to step back, her genuine personal choice, made after years of sustained intensity, had been read by someone as a positioning rather than a retreat. Not used against her, just noted, filed, incorporated into a larger map she hadn't known she was on. She should have been angry. She was, a little, but under the anger was something more complicated, something that had to do with the fact that she'd been seen clearly by someone, even when she was trying not to be visible, and that being seen clearly was not always a threat. Sometimes it was the reason you were still standing. "The evidence," she said, "the grand jury. Reconvened on the 14th. We presented on the 16th. He was quiet for a moment. 11 indictments. The network runs through 7 facilities now. We found an 8th after I got here. The architect is a man named Gregor Vale, who has been operating a private logistics company in the healthcare sector for 9 years and has never once appeared in any investigative report because he was very careful about the distance between himself and the nodes." A pause. "He was arrested in Phoenix on October 20th. Gregor Vale, the name Rowe hadn't given her." "Vance knew him?" she asked. Vance was recruited by him in 2019. He'd been in financial difficulty, bad investments, a divorce that cost more than he'd expected, the usual. Weiss said the usual with the tiredness of someone who'd seen enough corruption to recognize its ordinary origins. Vale identified him as a useful node operator and brought him in. For 4 years, Vance ran the billing irregularities through Kessler Valley's procurement system and took a percentage and believed, I think, that he was protected. That Vale's distance from the operation protected everyone beneath him. Until you got close enough to the documentation to prove the connection. Until then, yes. He looked at the window. And then I became a problem that needed to be solved. And Vale's solution involved making me disappear before the grand jury date. And I spent 3 days making decisions about which risks were acceptable and which weren't. A pause. Ralston was a risk. I knew what the facility was. I knew who ran it. I also knew I was out of options. And I knew that the one resource inside that building that wasn't part of the network was a nurse with a background that Vale didn't know about and couldn't have planned for. Emily thought about that, about being the variable that wasn't on someone else's map, about the strange specific value of being the thing that power had decided wasn't worth watching. What happens now? She asked. Not about his case, she meant for him, in the particular immediate sense of a patient she'd treated. Another 3 weeks in here, probably. Then testimony. Then he stopped. Then I figure out what I do after the thing I've been doing for 2 years is finished. He looked at her with the directness of someone who'd given up on conversational cushioning sometime around day 2 of running injured through Montana. You're going to take the coordinator position. It wasn't a question. How do you know about that? Roe mentioned it. He almost smiled again, more successfully this time. She said you hadn't decided yet. I told her you'd take it. You don't know me well enough to... You came back, he said. At 6:49 in the morning, after a full shift, after being escorted out of a trauma room, after being told through a phone call to stay away, you badged back in. Not because someone ordered you to, not because it was procedure. He paused. You came back because you didn't know how to leave something unfinished when you had the capacity to finish it. She looked at him. That's not someone who's going to keep choosing small, he said. The room was quiet. The monitors were quiet. Outside the window, Helena in late October was doing the particular gray sky thing of northern cities in autumn, steady and unhurried. She didn't say anything, but she didn't argue, which for Emily Carter was more or less the same thing. She took the position. She gave interim administrator Spence her answer on October 28th, in a brief conversation that Spence received with professional satisfaction and zero sentimentality, which Emily appreciated. There was a formal announcement sent to hospital staff on October 30th, 2 paragraphs that described the new role and named Emily as its first occupant. She read it once. She didn't keep a copy. What she kept, instead, was a small piece of understanding she'd arrived at somewhere between October 14th and October 28th, in the gaps between the formal statements and the radio traffic and the conversations with Roe and Patricia and Weiss. It didn't have a clean shape. Understanding rarely did, in her experience, but it was real, and it stayed with her. She had spent 14 months in Ralston trying to make herself small enough to be left alone. She told herself it was what she needed. She'd told herself the noise and the significance and the sustained intensity of what she'd done before had cost her something she was recovering. And some of that was true. She had been tired, in a way that went past sleep, and she had needed something quieter than what she'd had. But somewhere in the management of her own smallness, she'd confused diminishment with rest. She'd taken the fact that people looked through her and translated it as permission to look through herself. She'd heard 14 months of subtle dismissal and not always successfully separated it from an internal voice that sometimes agreed with the dismissal, that sometimes wondered if the things she knew and could do were artifacts of a context that no longer existed. And then a man had come through an ER door at 2:11 in the morning with a story that didn't match and a tattoo that did, and she'd known immediately, without doubt, in the specific way that real knowledge lived in the body before it organized itself into language, she'd known what she was looking at. That knowledge had been there the whole time. The 14 months and the bad coffee and the sideways looks and the administrator's dismissal hadn't touched it. It had been inside her, intact, waiting not for permission, but for a reason. She thought about Ricky, who had held the light steady, She thought about Garrett, who had gone to find Roe without asking for an explanation. She thought about the motivational poster in the break room, the mountain that looked like an obstacle, and thought that maybe the problem with motivational posters was that they tried to tell you something from the outside that only meant anything when you arrived at it yourself. Nobody could tell you what you were worth. They could dismiss you, which Vance had, and they could recognize you, which Steele had, and they could need you, which Weiss had. But none of those things were the same as knowing it yourself. And knowing it was the part that didn't come from being told. It came from the moment you reached for the bent needle. It came from the moment you stopped apologizing for the space you occupied and just used it. Richard Vance pleaded not guilty on October 29th and was remanded without bail. His medical license, held since 1994, was suspended by the Montana State Board of Medical Examiners on November 3rd pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The suspension notice was public record. Gordon Fisk surrendered his law license in a separate proceeding on November 12th as part of a cooperation agreement that his attorney negotiated with federal prosecutors. The terms of the agreement were sealed. Gregor Vail, founder of Vail Healthcare Logistics, was indicted on 47 federal counts on November 18th. The indictment ran to 63 pages and named 12 co-conspirators across 7 states. 3 of them had already entered plea agreements by the time the indictment was filed. These facts arrived in Emily's life in the way that consequences of large things arrived, at a distance, through official channels, without the drama of the night they'd been set in motion. She read the case updates when Roe sent them, which Roe did with a consistency that was its own kind of communication. She filed them. She kept working. On November 1st, she ran her first training session as Emergency Response Coordinator. 12 staff. Conference Room B, which smelled like old carpet and someone's lunch. She'd prepared material for 90 minutes and ended up running 2 hours and 20 minutes because the questions were better than she'd expected and she preferred genuine engagement to keeping to a schedule. Donna Pruitt was in the room. She asked 2 questions. Both were good. After, she was gathering her materials when Dr. Kearney stopped at the door. "Where did you learn the improvised retrieval?" Kearney asked. She'd been waiting to ask. Emily had seen her holding it since mid-session. "The bent needle adaptation." "Someone who'd done it in worse conditions than I have," Emily said. "Is it teachable?" Emily thought about Wes Taggart, who had said that improvisation was a discipline and had been right. "Yes," she said, "but not in 90 minutes. Kearney nodded. "Next session, then?" Emily said she'd put it on the schedule. On November 14th, exactly 1 month after Daniel Weiss had been brought through the ER doors at 2:11 in the morning, Emily received a formal letter from the Office of Commander Steele, now identified as Deputy Commander of a Joint Federal Military Medical Oversight Task Force based in Helena. The letter was brief, professional, and contained a formal commendation for her actions on October 14th, signed by Steele and countersigned by 2 names above his that she recognized and had not expected to see in print. The commendation did not describe the classified elements of what she'd done. It didn't need to. What it said, in the measured language of official recognition, was that Emily Carter had acted with exceptional competence and judgment under conditions of significant pressure, had prevented a serious harm to a protected federal witness, and had demonstrated the kind of clear-eyed courage that formal credentials couldn't confer and formal dismissal couldn't remove. She read it once, in her car in the hospital parking lot, in the gray November light. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the glove compartment, not because she didn't value it, but because she'd learned something about the difference between recognition and validation. Recognition came from outside and confirmed what was already true. Validation came from outside because you were looking for something outside to make the inside feel like enough. She didn't need the second thing anymore. She'd stopped needing it sometime around 2:44 a.m. on October 14th, in a trauma room where she'd looked at imaging that confirmed everything she'd already known and understood in one cold, clear moment that being right mattered more than being believed, and that being useful mattered more than being seen, and that the only person whose estimation of her capabilities had ever been fully accurate was herself. She started the car. Ralston's Main Street was doing its evening thing, lights coming on in the diner, 2 trucks at the fuel stop, a dog. Someone had unleashed walking with complete confidence down the center of the sidewalk. Ordinary. Modest. Hers, at least for now, at least for as long as this was where the work was. She thought about what Patricia had said. That's not what I'm calling to offer you. She thought about what Weiss had said. That's not someone who's going to keep choosing small. She thought about Ricky, who had held the light steady in the worst 31 minutes of Emily Carter's professional life and hadn't moved and hadn't made a sound, and who had been excellent at his job in a room where someone was trying to decide if the same was true of her. She pulled out of the parking lot. She had a 7 a.m. shift tomorrow. She had a training module to finish for the session after next. She had a commendation in her glove compartment and a bent needle retrieval technique to teach a doctor who was genuinely curious and a hospital trying to become something better than it had been. It wasn't a clean ending. There was no clean ending to the kind of thing she'd lived. There was only the next day and the work in it, and the accumulation of days that eventually told you, looking back, who you'd decided to be. She'd decided. She drove home through the Montana evening, and the sky above Ralston was the particular dark blue of a clear night coming in, and the mountains at the edge of town were just visible against it, and they looked for once exactly like what they were: large, real, permanent, and entirely possible to move through if you knew the route. She knew the route.